Hello, students of European history. This is Mr. Barron once again. Today we're going to be talking about World War II and the domestic front. Some of this information will relate to what we talked about yesterday when we looked at the war itself. And we'll go through the histories of Germany, France, Britain, the Soviet Union, and Italy at this point in time. And I'll just give you some information that is specific to each one of those countries and how they were faring during the war. First of all, with Nazi Germany, you have to imagine that the Germans were extremely happy with Hitler and everything that happened in the first couple of years of the war, with all of the tremendous successes, with all of the conquest that was going on. German public support for Hitler and the Nazis increased dramatically. The Germans, when they took over countries, they would tend to exploit those countries. They would steal their gold reserves, for example, and they would then force the industries of those nations to work for the Nazi war effort. In addition to that, the Germans also sent stolen booty and so on back to Germany. They made sure that the Germans were kept really quite happy with food from around Europe, so that public opinion would continue to be really quite supportive of the war and quite supportive of the Nazis. Hitler believed the stab in the back myth. He believed that it was the home front that lost World War I for the Germans, and so he was really quite cognizant that if the Germans were starving, for example, that they would turn against the war. And so he was really quite careful to keep the home front happy. Rationing does not even occur until 1942, and in fact, they really don't have every single factory devoted to war production until 1942 as well. And if you think about it, that's easily 2.5 years into the war, and it's also the part of the conflict in which they've already invaded the Soviet Union, and it's gotten really quite serious for them. With the Nazi ideology of women being at home in the kitchen and having babies and so on, it was really quite difficult for the Nazis to wrap their mind around having women take men's place in factories or in the workplace. And of course, they did need women to do that. So I guess there's a kind of Helga the Riveter thing that was happening. But generally, the Nazis didn't want that. And so they solved their labor shortage that they had with, sadly, slave labor. In fact, about 12 million people from all over conquered Europe served as slave laborers in Nazi Germany or in Europe working for the Nazis. It was about 25% of the German labor force in 1944. They were working, of course, in industry and factories and so on, but also on farms. And then they also spent quite a bit of time repairing damage from air raids, for example. Sadly, as well, concentration camp inmates were used as forced labor until they were basically kind of used up and done away with. Prisoners of war also were forced to work for the Germans, especially Slavic prisoners of war, Russian prisoners of war. And then also just Eastern Europeans in general were oftentimes brought to Germany as slave labor or really cheap labor. Remember that Hitler has this plan of Lebensraum, where they're going to replace all of the Slavic people in Eastern Europe with Germans, and so taking Eastern Europeans, using them up in the German economy, and doing away with them is part of those Lebensraum plans. The slave laborers either received no pay or very little pay, depending on who they were in the sort of the hierarchy of what the Nazis viewed different kinds of people. They lived in very poor living conditions, from concentration camps all the way up to sort of migrant tenements and that kind of thing. And you really, the different kinds of people, whether they were Russian prisoners of war or Jewish concentration camp inmates or French prisoners of war or Eastern European people who weren't prisoners at all but were labor, they had a very strict hierarchy. Some of them were more or less slated for death already and worked to death. Others received a little bit of pay. Living conditions, of course, very dramatically as well. So it's really a huge part of the German war effort, and it kind of makes sense from the Nazi point of view. But let's be honest, it's much better to have a kind of patriotic Rosie the Riveter who is working as hard as they can in order to create war material for the war effort rather than slave laborers who are just doing what they have to do and perhaps not doing a very good job. They're just doing a job that would be good enough to keep them from being shot for, sabotaging hand grenade or something like that. There is a minister of propaganda whose name is Joseph Goebbels, and you might remember we talked about him when we talked about Nazi Germany. And once the war starts, the propaganda increases to levels that hadn't really been seen before. Radio and film and newsreels and newspapers and all of that kind of stuff are attempting to get the Germans to support the Nazis and get the Germans to support the war effort. Starting in May of 1943, the United States and Britain start a major air campaign bombing German cities and trying to destroy German morale from the air. This has the opposite effect, basically, and stiffens the support of the German people for the Nazis, for their patriotism, and against the enemies who are more or less committing a kind of war crime against them. Like in Britain, as I'll tell you in just a minute, children were sent to safer areas. They were basically sent out of cities, sent to the countryside, away from their families in order to escape the bombs. Sadly, too, some children who were not considered to be German enough or Aryan enough were left in the cities to kind of just risk their lives. The Nazis really do have complete control of the country. It is one of these totalitarian states. People get rounded up for the very least little things, telling a joke about Hitler or doubting whether the war is going to be won, and that sort of thing could end up having people sent to a concentration camp. The Germans are generally pretty supportive of Hitler and the Nazis. Around summer of 1944, when it really does seem like the Germans are going to lose the war, there was a serious assassination attempt of Hitler. There had been a number of planned assassination attempts that really never came to fruition. This one is called Operation Valkyrie. There's a film about it with that was put out a few years ago. You might want to check that out. It's okay. But what happened was the German officer corps, some of the Germans in the officer corps realized that they had kind of made a deal with the devil, with Hitler, and that the kinds of atrocities that they've been committing, especially in the East, were going to get Germany really in trouble with the world once the war came to an end. And so they tried to kill Hitler with a bomb. During one of his meetings at his headquarters, it kind of blows Hitler's pants off, but doesn't kill him. And then there's terrible vengeance enacted upon the people who were part of this plot against Hitler. At the end of the war, the fear of the Soviet Union, this is kind of what the officers were trying to do by killing Hitler, trying to get out of the mess that they had put themselves in by supporting Hitler and the Nazis and their genocidal plans. Now, fear of the Soviets from the general German public kept people fleeing in front of the Soviet attack. It also kept the Germans fighting, trying to slow down the Soviets. Perhaps they were hoping that the British and the Americans would reach them first, but this was a kind of desperate fight at the end to keep the Soviets at bay. When we talk about the Holocaust and genocide, we might want to remember that going back to the late 1930s, as soon as the war broke out, people were euthanized, people were sterilized. This is part of the Nazi eugenic plan, and that is added to when Poland is taken over and the Polish leadership class, as I mentioned yesterday, was liquidated or killed by the Nazis and also by the Soviets. In 1939, as soon as the war breaks out, Jewish people in Poland were crowded into ghettos. That is to say, fenced off, walled off parts of cities where Jewish people are crammed in there without enough food to eat and without enough medical treatment or anything like that that's going to help them. These ghettos are self-run by Jewish people, and that doesn't really make the conditions in these ghettos really any better, as some people were connected to the people who were running the ghetto from the inside, and some people weren't, and so it kind of sets Jewish people against each other, and and is really quite unpleasant. And when the Soviet Union is invaded in June of 1941, hundreds of thousands of Jewish people fall into the hands of the Nazis, and the Nazis put together those very same Einsatzgruppen, or special purpose police, that had liquidated the Polish leadership class, and these groups of special purpose police go around rounding up Jewish people behind the battlefront and simply shooting them. And they do this by the hundreds of thousands of people. They simply march people to a gigantic ditch that had been dug, and line people up and shoot them, and a group of people fall into the ditch. The next group of people run up to the ditch, and they too are shot. It is the way that the Nazis were eliminating people before they started the death camps, and this lasts really through about 1942. Sadly, too, there's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of people who live in areas of Ukraine or Estonia or Latvia, parts of Eastern Europe, where the local populations are anti-Semitic, and they actually help the Germans round up Jewish people, help them find them, help them denounce them, and oftentimes help them murder them as well. Something that really doesn't get talked about very much in the West is the way that the Soviet prisoners of war were also subjected to more or less murder or a kind of genocide. The Nazis capture hundreds of thousands of Russian prisoners of war. They don't want them to be alive. These are young Slavic men. For the Nazis, these are inferior people who have been trained to kill and are dangerous for the Nazis, or dangerous for Nazi Germany. And so these Russian prisoners of war were oftentimes kind of starved to death, or they were simply murdered in prisoner of war camps over a long period of time. And we're really talking about millions of Soviet soldiers that this happens to during the war. In 1942, in the suburb of Berlin known as Wannsee, there's a conference of a bunch of high-ranking Nazi bureaucrats, men from the SS, who get together to plan what they call the final solution to the Jewish problem. This is part of Hitler's plan for Lebensraum, but this is also a kind of practical solution, if you will, for the millions of Jewish people who the Nazis have captured, so to speak, in Poland and in Eastern Europe. The ghettos that had been established in 1939 were emptied by train, and people were sent by train to death camps that had been established. The prisoners then, when they reached the death camp, were chosen either for work or immediate death, depending on their age and their health and things like that. And the Nazis had set up gas chambers using a kind of a concentrated pesticide called Zyklon B gas, and people are crowded into these so-called showers that the Nazis had set up, and of course water doesn't come out of the faucets, but instead poison gas comes out. And within 30 minutes or so, the people who had been crowded into these gas chambers were asphyxiated or poisoned to death. The bodies then were taken out of the gas chambers and brought to crematoria, where they were first plundered for any kind of valuables like gold teeth or anything like that, and then burned. This is really quite difficult to believe that it ever actually happened and that people were capable of doing this kind of thing. I'd like to explain it in terms of history, at least explaining to you how this was able to happen in terms of things that we've already studied. If you think about it, the technology exists at this point in time to make this possible. In other words, you have trains that, from the Industrial Revolution that can bring people to these camps. You have poison gas from the Second Industrial Revolution that is what's being used to do away with people. You have a bureaucracy, which once again is sort of a second half of the 19th century invention, which can run these camps, which can run the transportation of people to the concentration camps. And then you have the totalitarianism with the kind of genocidal and murderous intent of Nazism that makes a kind of philosophy that makes all of this possible as well. The Holocaust itself has about 6 million or more victims, people who are killed in these camps, and it's just one of the saddest chapters, I think, of world history. On the top left, you see the large ditches that I was talking about, and the Einsatzgruppen, who are just shooting at people who are on the edge of the ditch, and as they fall into the ditch, the next group of prisoners come up and stand at the ditch and are shot as well. To the right of that are concentration camp inmates standing at the electrified fence of the concentration camp. And then you see a Jewish gentleman clearly labeled or denoted by that yellow star that he was forced to wear on his clothing. In the middle, there are canisters of the Zyklon B gas. Down to the left, you can see the Birkenau extermination camp. There are gas chambers you can see up at the top right of that, and trains that actually come right into the concentration camp. There's a bunch of houses there for people who were going to be worked, and as I said, the trains would come right into the camp. People would be selected right away for death or for work, and were marched off to the gas chambers or marched off to these buildings where they would be staying. And then there are people being deported in the bottom right as well. It's everyone. It's an entire family or families. It's entire communities that are being done away with. It's really, as I said, very sad and really quite hard to believe. Here's a map of the concentration camps. The red concentration camps are the death camps. The lighter colored concentration camps are not specifically death camps where people are being murdered with poison gas, but they are places where the enemies of the Nazis or the victims of the Nazis are being concentrated and basically kind of abused to death or worked to death. Lots of deaths happen in all of those concentration camps all over the place, but really the millions of people who are killed with poison gas, that's all happening in the East, where larger numbers of the victims of the Holocaust were from. Something that you may not know is that each and every one of these camps, too, has oftentimes dozens or scores or even hundreds of sub-camps. So they really are all over the place. They're all located throughout all of Germany. They might be, for example, a sub-camp of Buchenwald might be at a production site for German helmets or tires or something like that. And it could be 10 or 20 miles away from Buchenwald. But it was basically the same kind of thing where people were terribly abused and kind of worked to death. There were a number of air war crimes that occurred in addition to the genocide and everything else that was happening. You have airplanes attacking people from the air, and the people who are being attacked are more or less innocent victims. You had that when the Germans were doing their Blitzkrieg. Oftentimes the German Air Force was attacking civilians in addition to military units, just to sow discord and chaos and fear and that kind of thing. The Blitz over Britain, when the Germans were attacking Britain during the Battle of Britain, destroyed about 1 million homes and killed about 43,000 people. Once again, the idea behind that was to break the will of the enemy or damage their morale, but it oftentimes or always really had the opposite effect. People spent a lot of their time waiting out air raids in shelters together. As I said, children were sent to safer areas. In Britain, for example, you might know the story of Narnia. Those are kids who were sent away from London to go live in the countryside, and they just happened into finding a kind of wardrobe that took them to another place that wasn't really safe either. The Anglo-American bombing campaign that starts in May of 1943, as I said, destroys about 1/3 of German buildings. There were a couple of fire bombings, which are especially notorious. You might have read Slaughterhouse Five and know about the firebombing of Dresden. There was a firebombing of Hamburg as well, in which both of which killed tens of thousands of people in these cities. The Germans were unable to continue to attack Britain by air with airplanes after about 1941 or so, but they invented a couple of different kinds of rockets. One is more like a kind of dumb cruise missile, and the other one is actually a kind of intercontinental ballistic missile called the V1 and V2 weapons. And these are really quite frightening. They are unmanned rockets or cruise missiles that are fired at Britain and land and destroy buildings and kill people. It's kind of interesting too to note that the V in V1 and V2 is for the German word for revenge. So the Germans are considering these weapons revenge weapons for the Anglo-American bombing, but I'm sure the British aren't feeling like this is the case. The Germans spent a lot of time during the war with those kinds of Einsatzgruppen, the special purpose police units or units behind the lines, committing atrocities. They battled against partisans or guerrilla fighters. They executed a lot of civilians just in general, not necessarily Jewish people. Oftentimes they're people who were innocents who were being killed because guerrilla fighting or partisan fighting was going on in any given country. The fight in Yugoslavia is especially brutal, with Croatians allying with the Germans in order to kill and persecute Serbian people, Roma people, and Jewish people. And somewhere around 350,000 Serbs and Roma and Jews are killed in Yugoslavia. Once again, there's a lot of local collaboration with the Germans, and there's also the revenge that the Soviets get upon the Germans when the Soviets take over their part of Germany. It's almost a policy for the Soviet soldiers to rape women in areas that they are taking over, and about 2 million Germans die trying to flee the Soviet advance or getting caught in the Soviet advance at the end of the war. At the very end of the war, then, somewhere between 10 and 12 million Germans fled or were forced to flee from Eastern Europe by 1946. This solves this German problem of irredentism in Eastern Europe. You might remember when we talked about France that France was split into two different territories. One was Vichy France, and the other was occupied France. And you might remember too that Marshal Pétain was the leader of this Vichy state. And this Vichy state is a collaborator state. They are collaborating with the Nazis. They look at the left wing of the population in France as an enemy, and they are I guess heartened with the thought that although they were defeated in World War II, they've been able to create an extreme right wing state from the mess that came out of that. Sadly, too, this right-wing Vichy government passed this very same anti-Semitic laws that the Germans had, the so-called Nuremberg laws, and mass deportations of Jewish French people ensued. I think it's somewhere around 75,000 Jewish people are rounded up, oftentimes by French people, and then sent to concentration camps in Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, all of France had to work for the German war effort and supply the Germans with food and supply the Germans with the industrial goods that they needed to prosecute the war. Once again, a map of occupied Germany and Vichy France, or excuse me, occupied by Germany, and then also Vichy France, and then also Alsace and Lorraine. Once June 6th, 1944 happens, once the Americans, British, Canadians land on France, a resistance movement which had existed even before that increased, and then the tables were turned upon the people of France who were the collaborators. Collaborators oftentimes were persecuted and humiliated. Could be things like women who had a romantic relationship with German soldiers, were oftentimes had their heads shaved and had wear placards that said nasty things about them and marched around the city. People who had actively collaborated could end up shot, could end up dead as well. Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, is the great hero of World War II, and we'll talk about him in Unit 8 as well. There's Charles de Gaulle, the hero on the left, and then Henri Pétain, the guy who ran Vichy France. He's tried after the war for basically treason against France and collaborating with the Germans, but he's found basically to be guilty and is not executed. Britain has a home front in World War II, which was very much like the home front in World War I. Government getting involved in people's lives, poor people really benefiting from the rationing and so on, and the lessening of social differences as people with great wealth, um, unless they are engaging in the black market, really afford things that poor people couldn't. Rationing happens, gardens are created to provide food for the people of Britain, and scrap collections are also done in order to have enough raw materials to continue the war. Britain survives the war with help from the United States. Billions of dollars worth of equipment was given to the British so that they could continue the fight before the Americans get into the war. And this is called the Lend-Lease Act. It includes 50 older destroyer ships to help combat the submarine threat. And as you know, the submarine threat is overcome both with technology and also with convoys. Think too about how Britain changes when millions of American servicemen show up to Britain before they invade France in 1944. These young Americans, young American men, are very American and really change Britain in some ways with American attitudes and American customs and so on. Pictures of the Blitz from 1940, and then there's Churchill staring us down. Really, Churchill is quite responsible for the British staying in the war and guiding them through the war. It's really kind of surprising what happens to Churchill at the end of the war, but I don't think I'll spoil that just yet. We talked yesterday about how the Soviet Union had this great patriotic war for the motherland, which doesn't really make a whole lot of sense for a communist country, but so be it. Nazi liberation from Stalin, as the Nazis invade Ukraine, for example, and the people of Ukraine feel like they're being liberated from Stalin. They quickly figure out that the Nazis are genocidal, that the Nazis view Slavic people as subhuman or inferior, and that they're going to be oppressed by the Nazis, turns the people of the Soviet Union towards Stalin against the Germans, and there was a massive destruction and loss of life in this war. I already told you that it's the great patriotic war with Stalin as the great hero. It already was a totalitarian dictatorship with a planned economy. They continue that through the war. They continue that beyond the war. But the one thing to think about for World War II and how it really changes things for the Soviet Union is how the Soviet Union at the end of the war was able to conquer Eastern Europe and then create out of Eastern Europe an Eastern Europe that is communist as well and under the control of the Soviet Union. It's kind of like the Russians winning World War I, or kind of like Peter the Great being able to take over all of Eastern Europe. It would have been that kind of a victory, and Stalin is the guy who gets that done. And so, once again, Stalin is considered to be this great hero, and a great hero for communism as well, as communism spreads just from the Soviet Union to all of these Eastern European states. Just some images of the Soviets during World War II. There's a funny anecdote. I don't know if I've ever told you this. I hope you haven't heard it before. I think it's funny. One day I walked into my son's bedroom and he was playing a simulation of World War II. And I said, World War II simulation. He said, yeah. I said, oh, what side are you playing? And he said, I just don't know what I'm doing. And I replied, oh, well, you must be Italy then. And really that's kind of the story of Italy. Italy has a poor showing in the war, really from the get-go, and from the assault on France, or the assault on Greece, or the assault on Egypt. It's just one failure after the next, and large numbers of Italians are just surrendering to far fewer numbers of their enemy throughout the war. This poor showing in the war leads to the decline of Mussolini. Mussolini turns out to be kind of a paper tiger, and once the mainland of Italy is invaded, Mussolini is overthrown, the Italians surrender, try to switch sides. That doesn't particularly work because the Germans are there continuing the fighting. And then I think I already told you that Mussolini was made a kind of puppet dictator of the rest of German-occupied Italy, but he really doesn't do very much. And in the end, at the end of the war, just days before the end of the war, he and his girlfriend are trying to sneak into Switzerland with a whole bunch of troops, and partisans stop the column of troops and kind of say, "Hey, we're looking for Mussolini." They find him, they shoot him, they string up his body and his girlfriend's body, and then just kind of everyone can have their turn at abusing those bodies. This happens in April of 1945. This too, it could be why Hitler chooses to commit suicide and have his body burned as well. He doesn't want to have his corpse, abused by the Soviets, I guess. So there's a couple of British soldiers receiving the surrender of, what do you see there, about 5 or 6 Italians, and then some ruins in Italy. There's Mussolini at his finest, standing on a kind of platform and looking kind of arrogant. And there's Mussolini and his girlfriend after they've been killed and kind of abused and strung up upside down. Well, the war is going to affect every single state, whether it's occupied by the Nazis or not. The war against civilian people was unprecedented. World War I was really about soldiers killing soldiers for the most part. World War II is really a conflict in which soldiers die, but many, many civilians die too. Lots and lots of innocent people are killed, either on purpose through genocide or through air campaigns or what have you. But it's really a sad, sad number of people who are killed. 20 million plus people are killed. That states that are occupied by totalitarian dictatorships, of course, I'm talking about Nazis for the most part, but then also at the end of the war, the Soviets experience totalitarianism as well, and they experience genocide in many of those states as Jewish people or Roma people or whoever the Nazis deem worthy of death are rounded up and taken away and killed. Once again, like in World War I, propaganda, it plays a major role, even a bigger role now that everyone has a radio. The mobilization of entire nations for the war effort is a part of World War II, as part of World War I, the rationing. All of this is a part of civilian life. But what's different about World War II is because of the total nature of the war and because at the very end of the war, really so much of Europe is destroyed and Germany, as I mentioned before, has no government at the end of the war. It's an hour zero or a chance to start over and start to create a Europe which is really quite different than anything that they had before. And in fact, that's what we get to. I hope you found this lecture informative, if not a little bit enjoyable. I look forward to giving you some more information tomorrow. Take care.